Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining me here in studio is Debra Shushan. She is Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. Also joining us in Washington is Guy Ziv. He's an assistant professor at American University. With us too is Matthew Brodsky. He is a Middle East expert and geopolitical analyst. And also with us is Khalil Jahshan. He is the Executive Director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Guy Ziv, let me start with you. It's only been a month since the Knesset was sworn in, and for the first time in Israeli history, the Prime Minister-elect, in this case, has failed to form a government. This is how Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded to this latest turn of events. Let's watch this.
Several weeks ago, the Israeli public clearly and unambiguously determined that I would be prime minister, that the Likud would lead the government, a right-wing government. The public elected me to lead the state of Israel.
So there we have Mr. Netanyahu telling us that he's the man to lead Israel. How serious a political crisis is this for the country?
Well, it's unprecedented. This is the first time that Israel has ever had to face two elections within several months of each other. And there were certainly other options, but those other options were not attractive to Benjamin Netanyahu. There is a certain indication that other parties would have supported even the Likud, the governing Likud party, to form a government, but not with Netanyahu. And that's really the key point here. Netanyahu is facing some major corruption scandals, a looming indictment that has resulted in opposition parties ruling out sitting with him in the same government. They could have and possibly would have sat with a different Likud leader, or perhaps the leader of the opposition party, Benny Gantz of the blue and white team. So there were other options. This was not the only option to go to elections.
So was it, Guy, the fact that Netanyahu is facing these charges, was that the only reason that his former allies in the former government refused to get into this new coalition?
Well, the proximate cause of the failure of Netanyahu to form a government was actually not so much about the indictments, but about Avigdor Lieberman's decision to play hardball with Netanyahu in his negotiations. So Lieberman's an interesting guy. He used to be Netanyahu's chief of staff many years ago. He literally carried Netanyahu's suitcases, and over the years rose up to become foreign minister, defense minister in previous Netanyahu coalitions. And he doesn't get along with Netanyahu. He does not want Netanyahu to serve as prime minister anymore. But the pretext for his decision to stay out of this coalition has to do with his bill to draft ultra-Orthodox Jews into the IDF. As you know, there's an exemption that's been around for many years, and Lieberman is seeking to limit that exemption so that there is a certain quota that would compel ultra-Orthodox men to serve in the army, and that was what he was not willing to compromise over. But the larger picture here is a personal animosity between the two of them, and Netanyahu simply having no other option other than vacating a seat, which he was not willing to do.
Debra, let's look at what happened here. Netanyahu's Likud party was the party that actually voted to dissolve the Knesset. Rather than give the president of Israel a chance to have someone else try and form a new government, I mean, would someone like Benny Gantz, who is from the blue and white coalition, would he have succeeded in forming a coalition?
Well, there are a few possibilities, right? I think as Guy indicated, President Rivlin could have gone to someone else within the Likud party. There are other possibilities like Gidon Sar, for example, who could have been tapped to form a government. And he would not have had trouble doing so, presumably either going to the same right-wing partners that Netanyahu was trying to go to, or he could have gone to Kahol Lavan, the blue and white party, and formed a national unity government, which by all indications blue and white would have been willing to join. They would not, however, have been willing to sit in coalition with Benjamin Netanyahu, particularly because, obviously, of the looming indictments and his attempts to gain immunity, which blue and white were very clear that they would not support the so-called French law that would have given Benjamin Netanyahu immunity as long as he served as prime minister. If the mandate had gone to blue and white, it would have been, I think, more difficult for Benny Gantz to form a government. There's the possibility that he could have tried to form a national unity government, but that would have required Benjamin Netanyahu to exit the scene. It would have been hard for him to form a center-left government just in terms of the number of seats available.
So what are the options where it required Netanyahu to leave? Or leave whatever coalition was being talked about?
So, yeah, so it does look like at this point Netanyahu will either gain a greater mandate than he had in the previous time around, to try to form this coalition once again, or we'll see a different sort of result. But from what we're seeing in the polling, the early polling, it doesn't look like we're likely to see a dramatically different result than we had the last time around, but we have months to go.
So, Matthew, we could have this all over again after September.
You know, there could be, right. There's been a discussion about that. But, I mean, I think what I see also as a likely scenario, and there's many scenarios that could play out, is one way you could look at it is that this doesn't really actually harm Netanyahu that much. This keeps him with a government for the next few months that's going to be stable. There's going to be an election campaign. Frankly, what we've seen in the earliest polls is Lieberman, who was the one who got out in November and pretty much forced the re-election issue to the forefront, that he is going to gain a few seats. But in the end, the seats that he is going to gain is not really going to outdo what the religious coalition on the right, who's going to eventually end up joining with Likud in this type of scenario anyway. So it's going to come down to the same butting of heads, which is going to allow Netanyahu to make the case to the public, as he did in previous elections, that I know there's a lot of small parties here, and this is this special issue and that special issue, but I'm the guy. I'm the one who can unify everyone and take care of most of these things, and I have a proven track record of wheeling and dealing. And one last thing I would add to it, say you're an Israeli leader and you're a little nervous about what the Trump administration may or may not put out as far as the political contours of a peace agreement with the Palestinians. Well, this kind of puts up a, hey, look, sorry, we can't do it right now kind of situation that he gets to say to the Americans. And that kind of could put a pause button on this, but we don't know. That could also rebound to his benefit.
And Matthew, what's at the root of these differences between Netanyahu and Avigdor Lieberman? They were allies at one stage, as Guy just told us.
Yeah, I think a lot of it does have to do, first of all, with the policy that Lieberman is pushing. But Lieberman also has a very strong opinion of himself. And look, if you're in politics anywhere, you have to have a strong opinion of yourself. The thing is, his one issue happens to be butting heads with Netanyahu on something that really Netanyahu can't do anything about it. Like, what can Netanyahu can say, okay, so what? I'm going to dump a larger coalition of people that are my allies on certain things. There's not really much of a compromise. And Lieberman, being the guy who he is, is, of course, sticking to his guns. Lastly, I would just quickly add that it's amazing that he pulled out of the coalition in November and then seemed perfectly irrelevant for having done so after a couple weeks when it turned out that there were terror tunnels from Lebanon, because ostensibly this issue was about Netanyahu not going far enough in Gaza. And then suddenly everything goes back around and he's become the kingmaker or the kingslayer, if you're a Game of Thrones person,
right,
in this scenario.
Khalil Jahshan, what is the Palestinian view of all this happening in Israel?
They are probably as baffled by it as much as anybody else. Of course, it's a lot of these issues are very crucial, are matters of life and death for the Palestinians. But they're used to that. Israeli politics, this is not the first time surprises emerge or pop their head after Israeli elections, but this is a first. It has never happened before where the winner of a major national election couldn't or failed to form a government. So they are trying to adjust. But frankly, considering where things are right now, as far as the Palestinians' relationship with Israel and with the United States in terms of the initiative that the administration is trying to push in the region, this issue is totally irrelevant, except in terms of one term, one aspect of it, which is delay. Because frankly, these types of electoral politics, electoral games have been played in the past against Palestinians, simply in terms of Israel escaping the responsibility of having to deal with the issues and to deal with the compromises it has to make. So what the Palestinians are worried about is, there we go again, even though they are not necessarily enthused about this Kakamemi so-called workshop in Manama, but at the same time, they see the pattern of postponing and postponing and postponing again and again. So you have 6 months now to wait for Israel to have elections on September 17th, a couple of months to form a new coalition. Then we are too close to the American elections. You can't initiate a major foreign policy initiative in the States 1 year before national elections. You could, but I mean, this is an abnormal administration, but this has been the conventional wisdom. So the Palestinians are worried about it.
All right, I want to talk a bit more about the new U.S. initiative later in the show, but I'm going to stick with Israel for the moment. And Guy Ziv, of course, we've been talking about this. Netanyahu is also facing these charges of bribery, fraud, breach of trust, and he's been trying to get the Knesset to pass laws that would immunize him from prosecution. Where does that now leave those charges and the Prime Minister?
Well, nobody knows. So this is the one major reason that Netanyahu did not want to go to elections again, because despite his promises prior to his re-election, he has gone back on his word and has been pushing his potential coalition partners to pass legislation that would provide him with the kind of immunity that he seeks so that he can remain in power and out of jail. And right now, because he wasn't able to form a coalition, because he's facing re-election yet again, that legislation won't happen anytime soon. And so this is a real risk for him. Now, he does have some built-in structural advantages, as any right-wing leader would have in Israel today. Most Israelis identify as right-wing, and the religious Israeli voters who vote, by the way, in very large numbers, much higher percentage than secular Israelis or Arab Israelis, they're natural coalition partners with Netanyahu. And so he has that kind of built-in structural advantage that will help him in the election. And he also, of course, has President Trump, and he will not hesitate to use President Trump, as he did today with Kushner's visit to Israel, to try to promote his positive relationship, his very strong relationship with the president. And I think Trump will do whatever he can to strengthen Netanyahu and maintain that he wins. But it's still a risk, and nobody knows for sure how this is going to turn out.
Deborah, what's your view on this legal cloud that's sitting over Benjamin Netanyahu?
My view is that this legal cloud sitting over Benjamin Netanyahu is working to undermine Israel's democracy, because Benjamin Netanyahu has shown, I mean, we've seen that in the time since the last Israeli election, as he has tried to form a government, that he will do absolutely everything, anything and everything, in order to try to keep himself out of jail. And so that includes things like demanding support among potential coalition partners for this so-called French law that would give him immunity while he's prime minister. It also has, in addition to that, led Netanyahu to pressure potential coalition partners to support a bill that would take away judicial review from the High Court, so that they wouldn't be able to review that French law measure, or, by the way, other measures that are likely to be considered in the Knesset, specifically concerning annexation. So basically, what we see is a prime minister who's been in power for 10 years, who is hell-bent on gaining a 5th term as prime minister, both because undoubtedly, he sees himself as Israel's indispensable man and the one man who can serve Israel's interests and its security and all of that. But at the same time, because he knows that continuing on as prime minister is his surest path to staying out of jail. And this is just horrible for Israeli democracy.
Matthew, is this going to be an election issue?
I mean, yeah, to an extent. Look, imagine a normal American election where a politician makes all their promises, you know, and intuitively one understands that they're not really going to do all these things. But then you go a few weeks into an administration, and then you get to see kind of how the sausage is made and what parts were and weren't actually totally serious. And that's kind of what we've done here to an extent, and then called a redo. So, yeah, that kind of thing can come back to bite him. But I mean, in the end, I still think that's most likely he will be the most able to put together a coalition. I think he's benefited from people around him who have not taken advantage of the opportunities that they've had, which has also helped him. And also, I would add, even though I have no horse at all in this race, if one were Israeli and kind of deciding between someone on the right or someone on the right or someone on the right, then the person, if you want to have a really good relationship with the United States, we seem to have a president in office, right, who really values personal connections to a very strong degree with certain leaders. And I think that kind of relationship is something that works both ways. And I think President Trump, of course, when it comes to re-election, will also be counting on Netanyahu to the same extent. Little tweets of support go out here and there.
Despite the fact that the New York Times said today that his aura of invincibility has been seriously
the New York Times said that? Well, wow, then I'm shocked. Wow.
Right. Guys, Dave, before we get on to the U.S. peace plan, one more point on the Israeli elections and what's happening politically in Israel right now. Would it be fair to say that nationalist parties, right-wing parties have been getting more and more powerful and influential in the country?
I think that is fair to say. The strength of the right is that, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of religious voters, more and more religious voters every year. They vote in higher numbers. A lot of the ultra-Orthodox who used to consider themselves non-Zionist and had no dog in this fight, they've been increasingly becoming right-wing as well. Politically, at least some of them have. And then you have people like Avigdor Lieberman, who's not religious at all, very secular, but nationalism and populism and kind of right-wing nationalist populism are very strong themes today. And I think that as long as they're united, that's where their strength is. In the last election, by the way, there were several prominent right-wing religious politicians who didn't get in despite having gotten many votes. So there were millions of votes, or maybe not millions, but there were hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million votes that were lost because people split their votes among the different parties, including some of the smaller parties. So I think what Netanyahu is going to try to do, which he did to some extent last time, is unite the right.
All right, Khalil, let's talk about the latest peace plan. Jared Kushner, President Trump's envoy, also his son-in-law, he's been on a visit to the region to talk about the new peace plan. There is this meeting, as you pointed out, that'll be taking place in Manama in Bahrain. The Palestinians will not be there. My understanding is that Jared Kushner has been to talk with the Moroccans as well.
And Jordanians.
And Jordanians. And
today in Israel, yes.
Yes, and they've not shown much interest in being there as well. Could his timing have been better or worse?
Frankly, I'm not worried about, if I were him, about timing. I'm worried about substance. The problem he's having is with lack of substance. He did not do his homework. He thinks that the world started with him taking over this responsibility. He doesn't acknowledge that there has been at least 78 attempts at peacemaking in the Middle East, including about 34, 35 of them U.S. peace plans since 1937, the first partition. And he thinks he read enough books about Singapore and Japan to make a difference, applying that to the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Who specifically are we talking about? Huh? Who specifically are we talking about?
About Kushner and the rest of the team. Okay. So we are having some difficulty marketing this process. Even he hasn't been able to even coordinate with the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis don't know the full details yet because he doesn't know. Look, for God's sake, the president hasn't seen the final plan yet, and we call it the Trump peace process or whatever, deal of the century. And he hasn't seen the final version yet because there isn't a final version. So what they have right now is phase one, which essentially is an economic plan to try to dump some investments into the region, distract the people away from their national rights, forget about occupation, let people work and make money, and maybe they will forget that there is a political issue dividing these parties and has been doing so for 71 years.
Right, Matthew, this plan does talk about increased investment in Palestinian territories. It doesn't talk, as Khalil just pointed about some of the key issues that have really bedeviled these negotiations in the past, things like an end to the occupation, border issues, status of Jerusalem, status of Palestinian refugees, etc. Does it have any chance at all?
Well, what they haven't done, and first of all, I would take issue with his way of characterizing them. I know these people who are working that being Jared Kushner, Jason, and of course David Friedman.
Of course, David Friedman.
Well,
Let's not forget him.
Why not?
You run out of people.
The point is that they have done an incredible job of meeting with people on both sides of the aisle, people who've been involved in the peacemaking process for the United States and elsewhere, and have taken many meetings with them. Not photo op meetings, but to get substantive meetings and advice. And so they've done that. If they just wanted to turn their back and pretend they knew nothing, then they would have had a much different approach. That's not been their approach. As to the substance, though, they've been quite clear that the political aspect of the plan is going to address all of the core issues. The economic plan is another pillar of the overall peace plan. So to say that, I mean, so your question is essentially they just haven't dumped out all the information and all the details yet, but I wouldn't expect
they
them
don't need to dump it, but consider, even if your perspective is correct, where is the basics? I mean, why aren't they able, for example, to pronounce these words like two-state solution, end of occupation, self-determination for the Palestinians? These are basics. We've had at least 30 years in this country of experience trying to solve this issue. We haven't succeeded, but we have succeeded in creating some fixed terms of reference that every idiot who has focused on this issue would know that without focusing on these issues, we're not going to get anywhere. So talking to people, name one Palestinian they talk to who's independent, who's experienced in this country.
The Palestinians.
Zero in this country.
They've talked, yes.
Fellow Americans.
I've met with at least
you
5 or
met
6 of
because
them.
you're Jewish, not me.
No, I've met with them who have also met with these
all right.
people
name
at the White
one.
House. Name one?
Yeah, name one Arab American.
I'm not going to put their
name
names
one
out there.
Arab American.
They work at well-known think tanks that you know very well.
All right.
That's a pretty.
All right. I want to move on. Debra, let me get your view on this. Jared Kushner has also hinted, and it's a point that's just been brought up, and we've seen some of these reports, that the latest plan will not propose 2 states. That has been at the core of U.S. policy ever since this has been talked about. The fact that he's not talking about that, how significant is that?
It's significant, and it's even though, you know, you'll hear from Jason Greenblatt in his sniping on Twitter against Palestinian leaders like Saeb Erekat and Hanan Ashrawi. You don't know what's in the plan. No one knows what's in the plan. Only myself and Jared and David, you know, David Friedman, and not even Trump. Maybe.
Help us. Who's David Friedman?
Oh, who's David Friedman? David Friedman, very quickly is U.S. ambassador to Israel and longtime supporter of settlements. Until he became ambassador to Israel, he was the president at the American Friends of Beit El Institutions, settlement in the West Bank.
Turns out he likes Israel. It's
really weird.
Oh, great.
Oh, turns out he favors perpetual occupation. And that's why the peace plan won't say things like 2 states, sovereignty for the Palestinians, end to occupation.
I think we could wait until we actually see what the peace plan
You're
is.
joking.
And
You're
then
joking,
judge
right?
it.
Look, some of us have been dealing with this
I have a good joking face. This one isn't it?
for longer than you have lived.
Okay.
I mean, we've had,
all right, you got me beat by age. Good
all right,
argument.
Guy Ziv is waiting patiently out there. Guy, do you see this Jared Kushner plan survive if there is some kind of realignment of parties after the next election in Israel that could shift the country even further to the right?
I really don't take this plan very seriously. I don't know many experts who do. I mean, you have here somebody who has absolutely no experience, no expertise, who's dismissive of expertise. And even those experts who are not necessarily political doves have criticized the plan or what they know about the plan very harshly and said it should never be unveiled. I don't think.
Okay, we're going to have to go, guys. Sorry to cut you off. We've run out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. But before we go, another reminder about the Heats podcast. You can listen to some of our great content through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. The podcast covers similar global stories that we do here on the show, but it'll also include some personal and candid interviews with our guests and correspondents. Just search CGTN and you'll find the podcasts right there. Thanks again for watching.